Welcome. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most complex and, let's be honest, challenging narratives in the entire Tanakh, the Conquest of Canaan. It's a story filled with divine commands, brutal conflict, but as we're about to see, the way the text itself frames these events is absolutely crucial for understanding the identity of ancient Israel. So, let's get right into it. Right off the bat, we have to ask the most important question. How does the text want us to read this? Are we looking at a straightforward military conquest, a story about taking land? Or is the narrative presenting something far more radical, a kind of spiritual quarantine, designed to protect a brand new nation from what it sees as an existential ideological threat? That single distinction, conquest versus quarantine, is the lens for everything that follows. So here's how we're going to unpack this. We'll start with the divine mandate. What was the actual command and its justification? Then we'll look at the religious threat. What was so dangerous about the Canaanites? From there, we'll get into the tale of two conquests, the command versus the messy reality. Then we'll examine the fates of the different nations involved. And finally, we'll see how this legacy of coexistence sets the stage for centuries of conflict. Okay, let's start with the theological foundation. The story in the book of Joshua doesn't just kick off with "go invade." No. The text builds on a justification that was actually established hundreds of years prior. It presents the entire campaign not as an act of aggression, but as a long delayed divine judgment.
And this verse, right here from Genesis, is the absolute key. God promises the land to Abraham, but then says his descendants have to wait 400 years. And why the delay? Because, and this is the crucial part, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This one line completely reframes the narrative. It's not an arbitrary land grab. The text presents it as a judicial sentence that has been pending for 4 centuries.
And that brings us to this critical and frankly very difficult concept of harem, or the ban. It's often just translated as utter destruction, but the theological logic here is really one of spiritual quarantine. The idea was to completely remove not just a people, but an ideology. It's about sterilizing the land from religious practices that were seen as fundamentally toxic to Israel's new covenant with God. So you have to ask, what exactly was this threat that the text says required such a radical, all-encompassing quarantine? To really get a handle on the harem, we need to understand the Canaanite worldview that Israel's being told to confront. And we're not just talking about different gods here. We're talking about a completely different and opposing way of seeing the entire world.
First up, you've got the headliner, Baal, the god of storms, rain, fertility. Now you have to imagine, for a nation of former slaves who are just learning how to be farmers, Baal is incredibly tempting. His worship was purely transactional. The belief was that engaging in sexual rituals at his temples would literally stimulate him to send rain and make the crops grow. This practice was in total opposition to Israel's new emphasis on moral holiness.
And then there's the worship of Molech, which is, well, it's horrifying. When a city was facing a major crisis, a siege, a famine, a plague, the ultimate sacrifice to appease this god was to offer your own child. And this isn't just biblical propaganda. Archaeology has confirmed this practice. The law in Leviticus condemns this as the ultimate abomination, the absolute polar opposite of a god who is supposed to represent justice and mercy.
And finally, there was Asherah. In some ways, her worship was the most insidious threat of all, because it was so easy to blend it with the worship of Yahweh. And that's exactly what happened. Israelites would often set up an Asherah pole, a sacred tree or a carving, right next to an altar for their own god. This blending of religions, this syncretism, becomes the central spiritual battle for ancient Israel for centuries.
Okay, so that was the divine command, the why behind it all. But what actually happened on the ground? Well, this is where the story gets really interesting, because the text gives us 2 very different pictures. The early chapters of Joshua read like a lightning-fast, total victory. But the rest of the book? It paints a much more fragmented, complicated, and frankly, incomplete picture. The text tells us there were 7 distinct groups living in the land. And it's important to remember, these weren't one unified people. They were a collection of city-states and different tribes, each with its own territory and, in some cases, its own military advantages. And this table really lays out the 2-part reality of the conquest perfectly. Look, Joshua's main campaign, it was a massive success. He absolutely shattered the organized resistance in the Central Highlands and the South, taking down a coalition of 31 kings. But, and this is a huge but, once the main army disbanded and it was up to the individual tribes to secure their own territories, the story changes completely.
They couldn't dislodge groups in heavily fortified cities, like the Jebusites in Jerusalem, or those on the coast who had superior military tech, like iron chariots.
So this incomplete conquest means there wasn't a single outcome for the Canaanite populations that remained. The reality on the ground wasn't a simple choice between destruction or expulsion. Instead, what you get is this messy, complicated patchwork of coexistence, servitude, and sometimes even integration.
I mean, just look at the different outcomes here. The Jebusites, they hold on to the fortress of Jerusalem for another 400 years until King David finally takes it. The Canaanites on the coast, they stick around and eventually become the great seafaring civilization we know as the Phoenicians. The Hivites from Gibeon, they cleverly trick Joshua into a treaty and end up as servants of the tabernacle. And you even have individuals like Uriah the Hittite, who becomes one of David's most loyal warriors. It's just not a simple story.
And this complicates the simple us versus them narrative even more. The text goes out of its way to show that belonging to Israel wasn't just about your bloodline. You have individuals like Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute from Jericho, who is saved and fully integrated into the nation because of her faith and her actions. And then you have whole people groups like the Gibeonites who secure a place for themselves through a treaty. The lines were definitely more porous than you might think.
And all of this messy reality, brings us to the long-term legacy. The failure to complete the conquest, as it was commanded in the text, directly plants the seeds for centuries of internal, spiritual, and political chaos for the nation of Israel.
Because at its core, you just have this irreconcilable clash of worldviews. Israel was built on exclusive monotheism, a centralized place of worship, and a moral law based on a covenant relationship with God. The Canaanite world was the opposite, polytheistic, with decentralized worship at any old high place, and it was all fundamentally transactional, based on rituals and sacrifices designed to manipulate the gods into giving you what you want. These two systems simply could not coexist peacefully.
And the biblical narrative draws a perfectly straight line from cause to effect. Step 1, the conquest in Joshua is incomplete. Step 2, this leads to coexistence, which then leads to syncretism, that blending of religions. And step 3, that syncretism becomes the trigger for the entire chaotic, violent cycle of apostasy, oppression, repentance, and deliverance that defines the whole next era, the time of the judges.
So we'll end with a question to think about. The text presents the conquest as both a foundational success and a profound failure. But maybe it was in grappling with the consequences of that very failure, the constant, grinding struggle against idolatry, the need to constantly define their faith in opposition to their neighbors, that the true religious and national identity of Israel was actually forged. What does it mean for a nation when its foundational story is one of an incomplete mission?